Well, one of the main ideas or premises of this exhibition was to reflect on the similarities of the stories we tell ourselves, whether they're indigenous stories or they're European mythologies or what have you, about how we relate to the animal world, how we relate as human beings to the natural world. And there are similarities in our stories. There are similarities and there are differences. So this exhibition was an opportunity to explore both similarities and differences. So if I'm substituting a swan for a goose, I'm sort of asking people to think about indigenous stories. And the Canada goose is really a symbol of Canada. And this exhibition is really rooted in a very Canadian perspective on Indigenous experience within Canada. And that's the larger story I want to talk about is how do I, as an Indigenous person, how do I think about the experience of being Indigenous in Canada? What does that mean? And once you get into that conversation, we're also talking about colonization and the impact of the European cultures, both French and English, that colonized Canada.
Il y a encore 731 à l'île Centre.
I would like you to start by speaking about why we are in front of two body of works, you know, your paintings and those incredible objects in the middle.
This was an opportunity to work with a museum collection, and I like to work with museum collections for a number of reasons. One, I get to discover things in museums, and having the opportunity to curate them along with the works that I create means I get a very rich combination of museum objects and the paintings that I make. So we sort of go back and forth between the museum objects. You see them reverberating in the paintings, and there's a dialogue between the museum objects and the paintings.
You are going in ancient Greek mythology, so you're transposing that Canadian experience in a very old iconography. You decided not to be like in today's world. It's a big and huge decision. Is it because you were doing a show for a European audience?
No.
Why did you decide to go outside actuality this time with those paintings?
Well, for many years, I mean, my whole life, I've been really interested in art history and the paintings of the old masters and those traditions of making images of stories, whether they're mythological narratives or they're history paintings or biblical parables. I've really been interested in this canon of art history that has described these stories. And so I've been looking over the years at many, many paintings and many different versions of Leda and the Swan, for instance, and was able to sort of see similarities about how those mythological stories could overlap or maybe even relate to stories that were told in Indigenous cultures about the animals that we relate to in North America. So it was a way to find common ground.
It's not about past or it's not about present in a way, that you're transcending all those categories, no? Are you doing that? That show specifically, but you're always doing that in your art in a way.
Yeah, I sort of collapse time in my paintings, and I think what I'm trying to do with that is to go back in time to reflect on what has happened over the last couple of hundred years and to relate that to our experience today. Because Indigenous people, we've experienced 152 years of colonization. And the art history that was being made, the paintings that were being made in Europe at that time were very much about exploring a narrative, were very much about telling a story. And so I brought that tradition of image making forward into the present to reflect on the history that has happened between the different cultures coming together.
So you selected carefully those 10 objects that are artifact and work of art. Some of them are Inuit works of art. There's 2, and Indian objects. Why those works? We understand why you selected the swan, for example, in relationship with Leda, and the eagle, going with your version of Ganymede. But why specifically those? You had the choice through thousands of objects.
Well, in fact, there weren't that many objects that related to Indigenous people. So it was
It's
actually
interesting in itself.
Yeah, so at the museum there were a small number of objects, sculptures that were made by Indigenous people of North America. So when I really pulled focus and really looked at those objects and was already thinking about animals, it was kind of a small group of objects. And then I unfortunately didn't get everything that I had requested because they needed to stay on permanent display, but I got a number of things that were about how Indigenous people think about animals and how the animals relate to Indigenous people in terms of our worldview and our mythologies. So you have here a goose, a caribou, and those objects very specifically are made by Indigenous people, and that's really what I wanted to focus on, were the actual sculptures, the artifacts or art objects themselves.
The fact that we have that ancient drum here is very interesting. So you decided to put it in that mythological revisitation of a myth that is in itself being revisited from time to time, Les Trois Grâces, and it's like mythology is in itself never a fixed iconography, it's a moving iconography.
One of the things, of course, the first thing I think about when I see objects like this in a European collection is how did it get here?
Yeah.
So we have a European collection, so somehow this Indigenous object, this drum or this sculpture, got to the museum somehow, whether it was purchased or taken, I don't know the provenance of it. But in a way, this act of reclaiming objects from the collection and integrating them into my work is a way to kind of decolonize the museum, to reclaim cultural objects or cultural artifacts, and to situate them inside a painting which is very much about a living experience or a way to relate to the world, which is very, very contemporary. Something like a drum is still very much a living thing. It's part of a living culture. So our songs are alive, and this is very much about making sure that this object still has life.
So life through painting, right?
Life through painting,
In this case.
absolutely, yeah. This is a story based on the Three Bears, and the Three Bears is essentially, it's a European fable. The original Three Bears story was about 3 bachelor bears, and Goldilocks was, interacting with these 3 bachelor bears. And this story was told to me as a child by my great-grandmother, who was Cree. So she was telling me a story that was from a European tradition at the same time that she was telling me stories about the Cree trickster, Wisagachuk. So as a child, I had a blend of stories coming from both European and Indigenous traditions.
Were they mixed together or
They were
separately?
told separately, but they
Yeah.
would be told, at the same time. Mm-hmm. So for me, this is about the reality of my experience, and this is very much about our cultures intermingling and being vibrant and affecting each other. So a number of years ago, I was painting as an abstract painter, and I felt like my paintings were becoming too cryptic.
Because they were abstract?
Yeah, becoming almost too personal. The language I felt was keeping my audience or the viewers outside of my intentions, outside of the themes that I wanted to explore. So I decided, after looking very carefully at the art history of North America, where I saw a lot of European settler artists making paintings of Indigenous people in a representational style, that I needed to challenge the narrative of this art history that was told about, the dominant narrative told about North America. But I also really wanted to speak in a language, a vocabulary of painting which is more widely accessible. So I could reach a much wider...
figurative art.
Figurative or representational work. So no matter who you are, you can understand or read at least one part of the image. You might not understand all of the layers in the image, but you can see something that you can readily identify with. So it was really about wanting to explore a language of painting that could reach a very wide audience.
I visited your studio several times in the few years. Why did you leave for the end in the process of painting important details that in a way transform the interpretation of the paintings, like the maple leaf in the three bachelors, like this necklace, because you've been painting that image for a year, and the necklace appeared just at the end, you know? Did you know from the beginning that you would do that?
No, I didn't.
And then it changed.
And this is why I love painting, because painting it's a practice that you have direct engagement with. It's more than just the idea, and it evolves through the act of making it. And this is what really distinguishes my practice from many other artists who just have ideas and then somebody else executes them. It's through this process of actually making the work that I arrive at a point where I make decisions that come through the process. So I did not know at the beginning that there would be this necklace.
Oh, yeah.
And then when I started to, and you look at the painting over a period of weeks or months, you realize that it needs something. What is this extra piece that will, complete the painting? And that means that you have to give that process the time that it needs to kind of percolate and to evolve. And so with a number of these works, these details, which are very important to the final piece, only arrive at the end. And sometimes it requires research, because I started thinking about this painting, for instance. I was like, I need something, a necklace of some kind. What is that necklace going to be?
And it's not only a necklace of some kind, right? It's a very charged necklace.
It's a very charged necklace. So I think with each one of the works, there is this thoughtful process about making those selections for the details that will complete the piece and shift the meaning and the perception of the work, interpretation of the work. So the inspiration for this painting came from a treaty between the Dutch and the Iroquois. It's called the Tu-Ro Wampum, or the Guswenta, and it was an agreement between the Iroquois and the Dutch in 1613. And it's a belt, a physical belt made out of purple and white wampum beads. And the two stripes, the two purple lines in that belt signify the path of an indigenous boat and a European boat. And the idea was that the two boats would travel in a parallel course and they would not interfere with each other in the river of life. So this is very much an allegorical way of establishing a treaty where the Europeans and the indigenous people in North America would coexist in peace. The Raft of the Medusa was an important reference for this piece, because you have to remember that when Europeans first arrived in North America, they were helped by the indigenous people. And so I wanted to have this boat that referenced the poverty in many ways of those Europeans who arrived, not knowing anything about North America, who were helped by the indigenous people. And with them, of course, they brought disease. They introduced diseases to North America that were not known in North America. And with these kind of iconic or symbolic characters that you see on this side, I was able to present the idea of the different civilizations that came to North America, whether they were the Spanish or the French or the English. They were all present in North America at some point. So it was a way of kind of dealing with the iconography and to represent a sort of symbolic exchange between the different European nations and the indigenous nations. And with the indigenous canoe, I'm referencing Delacroix's Christ at Sea. So that was a beautiful painting for me that really spoke about this idea of turbulence. Christ being asleep in a storm and being blissfully asleep while all of this turbulence was kind of brewing around him. And I have Mischief blissfully asleep here. And so this idea of dreaming, and in this case it's an erotic dream, so she's also imagining these new people coming. So there's a number of different sort of thematic touchstones in this painting that reference dreaming and imagining and the collision of these different cultures. So, I mean, I have a few characters here, like they could be recognizably, Queen Victoria or Marie Antoinette, or perhaps a pope or a cardinal, a pilgrim, a Viking. We have a character over there wearing a plague mask. But what was really more interesting to me as this painting evolved was to make suggestions about these characters, but not to get too fixated on their exact interpretation. But what became interesting to me was how the things that people were wearing on their heads, their helmets, their headdresses, their hats, started to reverberate from the European vessel and the indigenous vessel. So we start to see the similarities of how even animals are interpreted through the things that are worn on people's heads. So horns on the Viking helmet, horns on the buffalo dancer. And for me, that was suggesting how similar cultures can be, even separated by an ocean. And so I was kind of imagining this these two parallel universes kind of merging and coming together.
Very well. Ollie and oval and cardboard. Oval facing out. Yeah.
I created an alter ego for myself, an artistic alter ego that could live inside my work. Her name is Mischief Eagle Testicle. So her name, Mischief, and mischief, and eagle testicle, egotistical. So the ego of the artist living in their work, representing that point of view, is what she represents. And with that character, I wanted to accomplish a couple of different things. One, I wanted to really situate a person who was representing the third gender, the person who lived in indigenous societies that was neither male or female. And we have in indigenous societies, before the European came, we had indigenous people that lived in the opposite gender, and it was accepted. It was unusual, but it was also accepted. It was part of how indigenous people see the world. And I also wanted to talk about colonized sexuality. Colonized sexuality, what is that? It's about Europeans bringing their binary understanding of male-female and not understanding that there could be plural sexualities, homosexuality that was present in North America, that there could be men living as women or women living as men. So Mischief really represents all of those things. She also embodies that trickster spirit, so she's playful. She also represents the spirit of love. And so she's often in a position where she's making love to somebody, she's making love, she's looking for sex. Yeah, she just represents a playful spirit as a trickster character. The other purpose of Mischief was to reverse the gaze, to become the artist who is looking at the European, because we've seen so many artworks in about North American art history where it was Europeans looking at indigenous people. So with that, Mischief has dealt with cultural appropriation, and in fact Mischief has worn these fake headdresses that were made by non-indigenous people to talk about how indigenous cultures have been appropriated and taken out of context by European artists or European people.
Mischief défie ainsi les représentations et les mythes coloniaux des peuples autochtones. Mais il existe une histoire beaucoup plus complexe et beaucoup plus sensible.
The Montreal Museum curated an exhibition of Jean-Paul Gaultier's couture, and it traveled around the world for about 7 years. The final installment of the exhibition was at the Montreal Museum, where they decided to just focus on his wedding attire. So he created a number of different outfits for all genders to talk about love. Love is love, regardless of your sexuality or gender. And so it's a wonderful exhibition. But he, for one of his gowns, he created a headdress based on a Plains Indian headdress. So it was direct cultural appropriation, borrowing from another culture and not really understanding the context, which is fine. But in this case, the Montreal Museum received some criticism for that, and they decided to ask me to engage in a dialogue about what that headdress meant in terms of cultural appropriation. So I was happy to do that because I wanted to engage in that conversation. Mischief has been wearing these fake headdresses for a number of different years, both in live performances and in my paintings, to speak directly to cultural appropriation. And what is cultural appropriation? What is that line between borrowing from another culture and stealing? And so I didn't really know with Jean-Paul Gaultier. I had to go into a dialogue with the museum and with Jean-Paul Gaultier to understand what the intention was. And it was an opportunity to, I suggested this performance, which is a mock wedding. It sort of takes the structure of a wedding where Mischief and Gaultier could exchange vows about respecting each other's cultures. And that was an opportunity to engage Mr. Gaultier in a discussion. He didn't understand the significance of the Plains Indian headdress. And so it was an opportunity for him to learn a bit more about that. It was an opportunity for Mischief to wear a very expensive Gaultier couture piece. And so in the end, I think everyone was happy with the result of this collaboration. And Gaultier was very generous and wanted to participate in this. And this is the resulting video of that performance.